Here's a sentence Boeing released back in 2023, a sentence that passed through lawyers, received approval from the corporate communications team, and was published on official company letterhead. Long-term partnership. That's the phrase Boeing used to describe its relationship with the Invictus Games. Not, we're exploring possibilities. Not, we'll see how Vancouver performs. Long-term. That's the kind of wording a defense and aerospace giant only uses when it genuinely intends it, because legal departments don't allow language like that unless they're confident in it. Then came May 2026, when Boeing confirmed it would not be sponsoring the next Invictus Games in Birmingham. One event. That's what long-term ended up meaning. One event. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. This is a Harry story. Harry's the face attached to Invictus. And you'd be right. Every other channel has Harry on the thumbnail, Harry in the title, Harry standing front and center, while the $63 million Invictus controversy lands squarely on his shoulders. But here's the question almost nobody is asking. Vancouver had Boeing and ATCO serving as co-presenting sponsors alongside more than 44 corporate partners. Birmingham, meanwhile, currently has just 11 unnamed sponsors contributing a combined £4 million toward an estimated £45 million budget. That's not a funding gap. That's financial devastation. Yes, government funding is expected to cover roughly half the cost, but the remaining half is supposed to come from private corporations and individual donors. And right now, those private contributions are drying up. Because businesses are asking the same question everyone else is asking. Why does this cost so much? Something happened between Vancouver and Birmingham that caused 43 corporate partners to vanish. This video will show you exactly what that something was, who created it, and why the word you keep hearing Meghan's name is the same answer. Boeing's risk department appears to have reached long before anyone else started paying attention. And by the time we reach the section where I show you, what professional event organizers, people whose careers depend on successfully delivering major events, are saying privately when Invictus contacts them about work, you'll understand the scale of the brand damage involved. Because they aren't just withdrawing sponsorship money. They aren't simply ending partnerships. They're turning down paid work. So why this week? Why now? Because Tom Bauer has just released his second book about the Sussexes. If revenge presented the argument, betrayal supplies the evidence. That's the difference. The first book built the case. The second one brings documentation. Bauer's reputation isn't built on speculation. His career history reads like a catalog of influential figures who tried to stop his reporting and failed. Robert Maxwell purchased publishing rights to block a paperback edition. Mohammed Al-Fayed rejected Bauer's claims for years until a BBC documentary ultimately confirmed them. Tony Blair, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, Conrad Black, Richard Branson, Bernie Ecclestone, Simon Cowell, 24 best-selling books. The subjects challenge him. The facts eventually support him. Again and again. History has repeatedly landed on Bauer's side, and the Sussexes understand that pattern, which helps explain why, when Betrayal was released, they did something they rarely do these days. They responded immediately. A spokesperson issued a statement describing the book as a deranged conspiracy and melodrama, a growing scandal involving Prince Harry and his last remaining genuine charity project, the Invictus Games. But is it really a charity project anymore? That question goes directly to why many of the people who originally helped create and build Invictus are no longer involved. The response was swift, it was sharp, and it was completely unsolicited. Now, some will say they were simply defending themselves. Fair enough. But they've ignored countless negative headlines over the years without responding at all. This one received a formal statement within 24 hours. If you want to know which accusations hit closest to home, pay attention to which ones trigger responses. The stories that don't matter are met with silence. This one generated an immediate rebuttal. Draw your own conclusions. And this goes far beyond embarrassment. What we're watching unfold is a contractual, financial, and reputational crisis playing out in real time inside government funding reports, corporate sponsorship decisions, and private hiring choices made by event professionals who have decided that an association with Invictus is no longer worth the risk. That isn't public opinion. That's a market judgment. The Invictus Games has now suffered perhaps its most significant setback yet, with Australia choosing to withdraw all funding from its team. And Boeing has now made its own position official. 5 exhibits. Follow the sequence carefully, because the sequence is the story. Exhibit 1. What long-term really meant. In 2023, Boeing announced what it described as a long-term partnership with the Invictus Games Foundation, serving as co-presenting sponsor for Vancouver. Not a test run, not a one-time arrangement, a long-term partnership. Those words were approved by Boeing's legal team. This is a defense and aerospace company. They manufacture military aircraft. They maintain active government contracts throughout NATO nations. Their corporate identity is deeply connected to military relationships. For a company like Boeing, supporting a veterans sporting competition wasn't simply an act of charity. It was part of a branding strategy. Being publicly associated with wounded veterans matters when you're selling aircraft to the governments of those very nations. So when Boeing described the relationship as long-term, they meant it. Then they looked at Birmingham and quietly stepped away. No official statement, no public explanation. Just a simple no. A company holding military contracts in the UK, a company that had openly committed to the long-term future of a veterans foundation, examined the next games and decided the relationship was no longer worth continuing. Vancouver had 44 corporate partners. Birmingham has 11. That kind of arithmetic doesn't happen accidentally. It doesn't happen because of Birmingham's location. It happens when a brand has suffered enough reputational damage that boardrooms across several countries conclude the return no longer justifies the risk. And that damage didn't appear out of thin air. There's a specific, documented point where the brand began to shift. And that moment has Meghan's name attached to it. We are watching the Harry and Meghan project unravel in real time. Palace insiders reportedly felt that Harry and Meghan had become toxic and could overshadow important occasions. Which brings us to Exhibit 2, the Instagram post and the private jet. Tom Bower's betrayal includes a passage that received a direct response from the Sussexes themselves, which immediately tells you it struck a nerve. Bower's account of Meghan's approach to the Vancouver Games, as reported through multiple publications following the serialization in the Times, can be summarized this way. Meghan wanted a global platform filled with admiration and enthusiastic crowds. Harry agreed she could take center stage at the Games, and shortly before flying to Vancouver aboard a private aircraft, she alerted her Instagram followers. Read that again. A private jet. An Instagram announcement. A sporting event created to honor wounded and injured service members being used at the same time as a content opportunity, a veterans competition, or a branding exercise. Increasingly, it appeared to be both. And then consider what Bower says happened behind the scenes. When Meghan entered the picture, I immediately wondered how it would unfold. He went on to explain that very few of Meghan's friends were willing to speak with him because, according to his account, she strongly discouraged anyone from doing so. Dozens upon dozens of emails were sent. Most never received replies. Meanwhile, 2 Canadian executives directly involved in organizing the Games on the ground professionals, not commentators, had reportedly become frustrated with what they described as the increasingly pushy behavior of the Sussexes. They raised concerns, specific concerns involving direction, priorities, and the allocation of resources. They objected through professional channels. And their assessment of Meghan's role in the operation came down to 3 words. She's bling, not rehabilitation, not recovery. Not support for veterans, she's bling. And that wasn't a tabloid headline. It wasn't a social media rumor. It wasn't anonymous gossip. It was a professional assessment, attributed to individuals responsible for delivering the event for the veterans it was supposed to serve. And according to the account, that conclusion wasn't driven by personal dislike. It came from watching the event evolve in real time and seeing what it was becoming. Bower also reports that Dominic Reed, who at the time headed the Invictus Foundation, had concerns of his own. Specifically, he worried the Games were beginning to resemble what he described as the Harry and Meghan show. The head of the foundation itself was concerned that the spotlight on the couple was eclipsing the athletes. That isn't criticism from an outsider. That's concern coming from the man running the organization. His concerns were recorded. And today those concerns appear reflected in a measurable reality. 43 sponsors who supported Vancouver are absent from Birmingham. That's not a coincidence. Which brings us to Exhibit 3, the executives who spoke up and lost their positions. The 2 Canadian executives who reportedly described Meghan as bling rather than rehabilitation did not run to the media. They didn't leak stories to tabloids. They raised their concerns internally, professionally, using the proper procedures. They reported what they believed they were seeing, and they were removed. Replaced. New leadership was installed. Leadership that apparently did not share the same concerns about the direction of the organization. According to Bower's account, Nick Booth was appointed chief executive following the departure of those executives. The people sounding the alarm were shown the exit. The people who remained inherited an organization that Boeing would later choose to leave behind. The warning was issued. The individuals issuing it were replaced. And the warning ultimately proved accurate. Meanwhile, taxpayers funded a significant portion of the event. According to filed tax documents, public money covered roughly half of Vancouver's costs. The Canadian federal government contributed $15 million through Veterans Affairs Canada. The province of British Columbia added another $15 million through its Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Sport. The rest was supplied by approximately 40 corporate sponsors along with roughly $2.6 million in private donations. Importantly, that public funding did not go directly into the games themselves. So, let's be clear about what the sequence shows. Concerns were raised internally. Those concerns were rejected. The people raising them were replaced. The event moved forward anyway. The private jet, the Instagram announcement, the luxury hotels, the high-end expenses that Bauer also alleges in the same book. And now, on the other side of that sequence, we're looking at 43 fewer corporate sponsors, a vice chairman who stepped down without explanation, and a defense contractor that publicly described itself as a long-term partner before leaving after a single edition. That's a direct line. A straight path from the warning signs that were dismissed to the sponsor board that's now largely empty. And if you think Boeing's departure represents the full extent of the damage, hold that thought. Because in about 5 minutes, the financial consequences get even worse. The same pattern of exit we saw with Boeing was repeated by a streaming giant attached to a reported $100 million deal. And this story includes what was described in reporting as truckloads of unsold products being handed out to employees because there was nowhere else for them to go. Exhibit 4. The Netflix expansion that survived just 7 months. In August 2025, Netflix announced an expansion of its relationship with the Sussexes, and it wasn't limited to content production. The company reportedly moved as ever, Meghan's lifestyle brand, deeper into the partnership itself. A larger product range, greater Netflix support, more integration. The entire arrangement presented as a broader creative collaboration. 7 months later, Netflix withdrew as an equity investor and walked away from as ever. 7 months, expanded in August, gone by March. According to reporting from US Weekly, citing a named source, the explanation from inside Netflix was straightforward. The show wasn't performing well, that's the diplomatic version. There really isn't much room to reinterpret it. Another reported assessment was even more direct. Harry and Meghan had become a major disappointment for Netflix. And while discussion continued around allegations and controversies connected to Meghan's time in the UK, the less diplomatic part of the story centered on what happened after the show ended. The remaining products weren't returned. They weren't sold through another retail channel. Instead, according to the reporting, truckloads of merchandise were distributed to Netflix employees. Truckloads, because there was no longer a commercial destination for the inventory. Truckloads of unsold jam. Take a moment with that image. Now let's look at the numbers. Because the numbers tell an even harsher story than the language does. With Love, Meghan, the series around which Netflix had built much of the As Ever partnership, and the same series used to justify the expanded arrangement, ranked 383rd out of more than 7,000 titles on Netflix's own engagement report for the first half of 2025. Season 2 failed to enter the global top 10 during its launch week. A streaming platform connected to a reported $100 million agreement found itself distributing unsold lifestyle products to staff members by early 2026. $100 million. Truckloads of jam. Different details. Same underlying pattern. But now we reach the exhibit that connects all of this together. And oddly enough, it's the one almost nobody has built an entire segment around. Because the most damaging verdict on the Invictus brand didn't come from Boeing's withdrawal. It didn't come from Netflix giving away inventory. It came from people who never participated in the first place. Exhibit 5. The professionals who refused the job. As preparations for Birmingham 2027 moved into the hiring phase, something unusual reportedly began happening. Experienced event professionals, exactly the kind of people you'd want managing an event of this scale, were approached about positions, and they declined. Not because the salary was insufficient. Not because Birmingham was an undesirable location. They declined after learning the project involved Invictus. Their reason? The organization's reputation. And that's worth sitting with for a moment. When Boeing leaves, that's a financial decision made inside a corporate boardroom. When Netflix exits, that's a performance decision driven by viewership data and business metrics. But when an event professional turns down paid work because they don't want their name attached to a project, that's something different entirely. That's a career decision. That's someone evaluating their professional reputation, reviewing years of industry relationships, and concluding that association with the Invictus brand could damage their own standing. These aren't online critics. These aren't royal commentators debating headlines from the sidelines. These are professionals actively working in the events industry. The people who know how to build projects of this size, and they don't want to build this one. It's worth remembering what Invictus originally was. The games were supported through Palace Resources, the Royal Foundation, Palace staff, logistical support, and diplomatic access. It was a large-scale institutional initiative created to help rehabilitate wounded veterans. But if association with the organization is now viewed as a potential career-limiting move, that's not a challenge solved by a press release. That's not a problem fixed through marketing. That's an industry-wide judgment, a private judgment, one delivered quietly, professionally, and without fanfare, which is precisely why it carries more weight than almost any public statement could. And I want to slow down for a moment here. Because beneath the sponsorship numbers, beneath the financial charts, beneath the headlines, there are actual people involved, and it's usually the people who make the truth impossible to ignore. Let me tell you about Melanie Poole. She's not someone you've seen splashed across tabloid front pages. She's not a royal commentator offering opinions from the sidelines. She's not a social media personality chasing clicks. Melanie Poole is a highly respected legal and governance professional whose career includes senior leadership roles at the Heritage Lottery Fund and the National Lottery Charities Board. In 2015, she established the Armed Forces Covenant Fund, the actual mechanism used to support armed forces communities across the UK. She was awarded an OBE in 2011. Today, she serves as chair of the Florence Nightingale Foundation, the nursing charity named after the woman whose work transformed care for wounded soldiers. Until recently, she was also vice chair of the board of trustees for Invictus Games Birmingham 2027. Then she quietly resigned. No public statement, no explanation, and the timing was notable. The same week Boeing's departure was confirmed. Think about who we're talking about here. A woman whose entire professional life has revolved around veterans, public accountability, governance, and responsible stewardship of public funds. Someone whose reputation has been built around service. She looked at what was happening around the Invictus project and ultimately decided that leaving was the correct decision. And then she said absolutely nothing. Not one public word. Consider what it takes to leave an organization like that without even offering a statement. She didn't criticize anyone. She didn't explain herself. She simply reached a private conclusion that her name and the organization were no longer moving in the same direction. Then she returned her focus to the Florence Nightingale Foundation. And that silence may be one of the loudest moments in this entire story. Because people with credentials like hers don't simply walk away without reason. The reason doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes the decision itself says enough. Then there are the Canadian executives. Unlike Melanie Poole, they did speak up. They documented what they believed they were seeing, professionally, directly. Through the appropriate internal channels, their concern was that Meghan had become a distraction from the veterans, that the games were drifting away from their original purpose, that the event was gradually becoming something entirely different from what it had been designed to be. They didn't leak information to journalists. They didn't run to the tabloids. They raised concerns internally, and according to the account, they were replaced. Those executives had invested years helping build a veterans organization they believed in. From their perspective, they were watching it shift away from rehabilitation and towards celebrity branding and social media visibility. They said so, and they paid the price for saying it. What makes that significant today is that the concerns they raised are now visible in the public record, available for every corporate sponsor, legal team, and risk department to review. They sounded the alarm. And events that followed have only increased attention on the issues they identified. Now let's talk about the money. Because this is the point where finance directors and corporate lawyers start paying very close attention. The UK government has committed £26 million to the Birmingham Games. Public money. Taxpayer money. The funding was allocated through the Office for Veterans Affairs to Birmingham, a city that formally declared bankruptcy in September 2023 after revealing an £87 million budget deficit and approximately £760 million in equal pay liabilities. Birmingham only emerged from formal bankruptcy procedures in February 2026. 3 months later, the Invictus funding concerns became public. That's the backdrop. A recently bankrupt host city. A veterans sporting event carrying projected costs estimated between £30 million and £60 million, with approximately £45 million serving as the working midpoint. Against that figure sits £26 million in government funding, and roughly £4 million from 11 unnamed sponsors. At minimum, that leaves a funding gap of around £15 million. And here's where the conversation becomes even more complicated. Government funding doesn't arrive without conditions. Public money comes with oversight, transparency requirements, performance targets, delivery milestones, benchmarks that must be satisfied before additional funding can be released. A Birmingham organizing committee struggling to fill key positions because experienced professionals are declining involvement is a committee that may face challenges meeting those milestones on schedule. Now consider Boeing's departure through the lens of corporate risk management, a publicly announced long-term partnership, followed by an unexplained exit before the next event. No public justification, no detailed explanation. The obvious question becomes, what did Boeing's risk team see in 2026 that it didn't see in 2023? The budget figures were publicly available. The allegations discussed in Bauer's reporting were publicly available. The reported cost per participant calculations were publicly available. Comparisons with the U.S. Warrior Games and its substantially smaller annual budget were publicly available. Corporate compliance teams exist to review precisely those kinds of factors. And at some point, Boeing made a decision. A calculated decision. One that appears to have concluded the reputational risk of remaining involved outweighed the benefits of continuing the association. They reviewed the information, and they left. Which leads to another problem. Replacing a sponsor like Boeing isn't merely difficult. It may be extraordinarily challenging without major structural changes. The companies capable of writing sponsorship checks at this level for a veterans sporting event are generally companies that benefit from military credibility, defense contractors, aerospace manufacturers, government-adjacent corporations, organizations whose brands gain value through association with veterans and service communities. And those are the exact companies now reviewing the same publicly available information, reading allegations involving private jets and luxury accommodations, reviewing cost per participant calculations, conducting their own internal risk assessments before deciding whether to attach their names to the project. Any company stepping into Boeing's place would eventually have to explain those numbers to its own board of directors, because those figures are public, they're searchable, and they're not disappearing anytime soon. At what point does a charity created for wounded veterans become a $63 million public relations machine? And have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle pulled the Invictus Games down alongside their own brand? In this situation, we're not dealing with the most strategic minds in the room. We've seen enough over the years to know that, seriously, that doesn't mean people aren't capable or successful. It simply means decisions get made, consequences follow, and eventually those consequences start showing up in places that are impossible to ignore. And that brings us back to the replacement problem. Because Boeing's departure didn't just create a sponsorship gap, it created a reputational ceiling, a ceiling that may now be extremely difficult to break through. And the Netflix comparison completes the picture. In August 2025, Netflix doubled down on the partnership. It expanded the relationship. It integrated as ever more deeply into the deal. It supported a broader product line. It committed additional resources. 7 months later, it was over. Inventory was being distributed internally. The company had effectively moved on. Look at the sequence. Public commitment, expanded investment, quiet withdrawal, no major public explanation from either side. Exactly the same pattern we saw with Boeing. And when two of the largest corporations in the world follow nearly identical exit paths involving the same brand within roughly 18 months, that starts to look like more than coincidence. That's not bad luck. That's two separate due diligence processes arriving at the same destination. Different industries, different executives, different business models, same conclusion, same brand. So, let's talk about the verdict. Not the summary, the verdict. Boeing called it a long-term partnership and left after one edition. Netflix expanded its commitment and exited 7 months later. 43 corporate sponsors who supported Vancouver are absent from Birmingham. Experienced event professionals are reportedly declining paid opportunities because they don't want the association. The vice chair of the board, a respected legal expert who helped establish the Armed Forces Covenant Fund, resigned without offering a public explanation. And the individuals who raised concerns internally were replaced before the wider public ever learned what those concerns were. Every one of those decisions came from people with something tangible at stake. Boeing had military relationships and government contracts to protect. Netflix had a reported $100 million investment connected to the partnership. Event professionals have careers built on reputation. Melanie Poole brought decades of institutional credibility and public service to the table, and yet every one of them ultimately reached the same conclusion: leaving appeared safer than staying. Now, the Sussex camp described Bauer's book as a deranged conspiracy and melodrama. Fair enough. But pay attention to what wasn't addressed. There was no release of the full, unredacted Vancouver budget that Rachel Maxwell reportedly sought through Freedom of Information requests. There was no explanation for why dozens of Vancouver sponsors are absent from Birmingham. No clarification regarding the vice chair's resignation during the same week Boeing's departure became public. No answer as to why a company that publicly committed to a long-term relationship decided one edition was enough. The response focused on the author. The documents remained untouched. And that's often where the most interesting questions begin, because criticism can be dismissed. Documents are harder to dismiss. Tom Bauer's previous subjects challenged him too. Robert Maxwell attempted to block publication. Mohammed Al-Fayed spent years rejecting the reporting. In both cases, later events became part of the conversation, not because Bauer created those events, because he documented them before everyone else was paying attention. History has repeatedly shown a tendency to revisit his work, which brings me to the question I want to leave with you. And I want an actual theory. Not a slogan, not a team jersey. A theory. Boeing described Invictus as a long-term partnership in 2023. Their legal department approved that language. Their government relations teams understood exactly what the Invictus brand represented within military and NATO circles. They knew what they were committing to. Then they looked at Birmingham, and they said no. Quietly, without explanation. So, what do you think Boeing's risk department saw? What was in the internal assessments? What was contained within the financial reviews? What emerged during the due diligence process that convinced a defense contractor to walk away from a veterans organization it had publicly described as a long-term commitment? What changed? Because when a company whose business depends heavily on military relationships decides that sponsorship is no longer worth the risk, something altered the equation. Something in the numbers. Something in the projections. Something in information that the public still hasn't fully seen. So what's your theory? What do you think sits behind the redactions? What do you think exists inside the sections that remain hidden from view? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. This is the voice of truth. Sponsors can leave quietly. Documents tend to stay forever.